Good morning, and thank you all so much for coming today. My name is Katherine Montana, and today my topic will be entitled "Changes in Expected Gender Roles in Depression and Wartime Era Montana, as Reflected Through Grieving Rituals from 1929 to 1945." Today, I'll be looking at the ways in which rituals designed to grieve a recently deceased loved one or friend reflect in Montanan society's changing expectations of gender roles during periods of economic and political upheaval, particularly looking at the Great Depression and Second World War. Since death is a phenomenon that occurs for all, each culture and each religion have both physical and emotional rituals to deal with the loss of a person. And thus, I believe a further analysis on how Montanans dealt with death is required in order to more fully understand this time period. This paper, using an array of primary sources, will expand upon the notion that the series of economic and political upheavals from 1929 through 1945 affected the state of Montana in all aspects of life, even down to its end. I believe that analyses of grief rituals are an important lens that can reveal much about a society's values. For those who honor their deceased loved ones, almost always wanted to do so in a manner that reflected the values of the person they were putting to rest, and thus often the values most prominent at the time. These final ceremonies in honor of those who had passed, both a physical act to put a body to rest and a cultural, spiritual, and or religious one that officially marked the end of one's time on earth, did not stop occurring when the world drastically changed with depression and war. In fact, regardless of any changes in practices over the years, forms of such rituals have continuously survived thousands of years of human history. Identifying such rituals in one form or another as a nearly always constant in society, and then analyzing the ways in which these practices did, in fact, have to be altered during a certain period, I believe, is an important lens to further understand a changing society. My thesis is the following. During the Great Depression, there was a conservative pushback against any changes in expected gender roles in Montana that occurred during this period. These changes were expected to be temporary adjustments as a response to the financial crisis. On the other hand, changes in expected gender roles in Montana were often accepted as potentially permanent during the Second World War. I argue that both of these ideas are reflected in the ways Montanans grieve their loved ones and friends who passed away during these periods. I have found evidence that, as a result of this pushback, grieving rituals, defined in this paper as any ritual designed to honor the dead, such as burials, memorial services, funerals, or even the organization of such acts, continued during the Depression as they had in the decades before the economic crisis. Despite many men losing their sources of income and women often being expected to contribute greater to household finances and or become the main breadwinner for their families, many male-dominated industries actively resisted any changes in the gender dynamics of the business world, very specifically reflected in the funerary industry. Therefore, despite these changes in expected gender roles that happened as a result of the Depression, women did not begin to participate more in the funerary industry or in the overall organization of grieving rituals as a whole. Because Montana had been hit hard by economic depressions and recessions in the past, many believed that the crisis would be a temporary one, and that supposed normal would one day be resumed. Therefore, certain changes in expected gender roles during this period were actively pushed to be temporary ones by many, tolerating alterations to gender expectations only where it was deemed supposedly necessary. In order to ensure such changes were temporary ones and that family life would go back to supposed normal after the economic crises ended, there is evidence that many were resistant to women taking up duties outside of the household in the business world, unless it was considered absolutely essential for the family's survival. This attitude is not only seen in the more obvious barrier of women having not much of an opportunity to become professionals in the funerary business industry during this time, but also seen in the explicit and sexist push to exclude almost all forms of female inclusion in grieving ritual organization as a whole, both within and outside of the domestic sphere. However, the Second World War was an entirely different dilemma, and many fear that men sent abroad to fight may never return. Thus, we start to see a significant shift in attitudes towards changing gender roles in Montana. specifically reflected in grieving rituals that took place at this time. Unlike the Depression, certainty about the temporary status of wartime adjustments was less clear. Women were accepted as more active participants in these grieving rituals and businesses, once very heavily dominated by men. A very noticeable increase in female participation in the funerary industry became evident in these years. Though some women quit their wartime jobs once the war was over, many, specifically evident within the funerary industry, continue to work outside the home in once male-dominated businesses. When I look into this subject further for my own thesis research, I want to focus more closely on the way grieving rituals changed or stayed the same for specific communities within Montana, showing how their attitudes differed on this topic, depending on factors such as cultural and religious influences within each community in the state. I decided to begin with a more general study today of Montana during this period that looks at the overall trends that I found. However, I believe the research I'm presenting today will be a useful stepping stone to a deeper and even more thorough analysis of Montanan attitudes towards gender expectations during this period. So for centuries in early American history, the physical burial and sometimes care of the body done pre-burial often fell to American men, but the organization of emotional rituals for honoring the dead across religions and cultures were typically assigned to women and took place within the domestic sphere. Before the 1860s, women tended to care for the dying at home and arrange the grieving rituals within the confines of the domestic spheres very often. Religious ceremonies were often held at places of worship, but the preparation of the body, family gatherings, and the organization of these ceremonies mainly fell within the domestic sphere. It was also very common to have home funerals at this point, also mostly organized by women of the household. The rise of the undertaking industry during the Civil War specifically started by the need to have a business become responsible for the extreme amount of burials happening at once on the battlefields, ensure that these rituals permanently moved away from the home, and thus mostly moved them away from being responsibility of women. So these two up here, I apologize for them being a little bit blurry. These two up here are before 1860, and they discuss home funerals being the standard. By 1929, the industry of death almost entirely belonged to male undertakers and male funeral directors in businesses operating outside of the domestic sphere. Most Americans have been using the services of established businesses to organize such ceremonies for decades at this point, and almost everyone used them to handle the organization of them as well. One would assume that to save money during a period of such economic hardship, people would shift back towards home funerals, or at least decide to organize such rituals from the home rather than pay to have them be organized through a funerary business. Particularly in Montana, this could definitely be assumed at first. Montana entered the Depression sooner than other areas of the country, feeling the effects of hardships by the late 1910s and early 1920s, and only having it intensify further when the rest of the nation entered the Depression in 1929. However, the evidence I have found is that funeral businesses stayed very much afloat during these harshest years of the Depression, even when other businesses floundered. Funerary businesses often lower their prices, or in some cases, charge next to nothing for their services. This was a long-term strategy to ensure that the industry stayed in business beyond the bout of economic hardships that all hoped would only be a temporary hindrance. There were changing expectations, both in Montana and around the country, in regard to a greater acceptance of women performing duties previously not considered typical within and outside the household due to the crisis at hand. This included a greater acceptance of women expanding their roles within the domestic sphere to alleviate pressure off of male breadwinners, or sometimes women becoming the main breadwinners themselves. However, it is interesting to note that many industries and businesses, such as the funeral industry in particular, resisted such changes that would either allow women to become professionals in the industry or grant back the business of grieving to the domestic sphere. Therefore, despite these changes in the acceptability of women's roles, women were not welcome to participate in the funerary business. This highlights the very present attitude of acceptance for changing roles for women, but only contingent on the assumption that these changes would be for only necessary alterations that needed to happen to keep families afloat during the Depression. Ultimately, this was an attitude that assumes such changes would be temporary. And right up here, we have examples from Montana, from Billings and Great Falls, talking about lowering funeral prices. And up here, these are examples of Montanans believing that the economic situation will be a temporary one. They're a little bit blurry. I apologize about that. I tried to make them as clear as I could. But so it talks about there's no way of bringing back normal than doing this. They're talking about how the government's fiscal year is coming to indisputable evidence that we are getting back to normal. So there was this attitude that supposed normal will one day happen, no matter how long it would take to get back to it. Largely more agriculturally reliant than many urban areas of the country, Montana was used to fluctuations in economic stability, though of course almost none as drastic as this depression. Nevertheless, an attitude of hope for a return to supposed normal was very much present within the state. This attitude grants further evidence that many in Montana expected and wanted to ensure that there was a return to what was deemed standard in terms of expected gender roles once the crisis eventually ended as well, thus helping explain why women continue to be limited in participating in certain male-dominated activities, such as grieving rituals. Women did not have the same opportunities as men to train in mortuary studies, to be able to enter the funerary businesses. And home funerals were actively resisted by men, and by women entering this field in any capacity were resisted as well. Of course, those employed in the funeral industry had a monetary reason to resist changes to the contemporary state of the business of dying. If they did not insist on funerary services continuing through these male-dominated businesses, then they may have been out of a job. And perhaps such rituals will return to the home on a permanent basis rather than only temporarily. Maybe if they didn't lower the cost of services, they might be out of business even after the economic situation changed for the better. Businesses such as the Fulkerson Nelson Mortuary, Plentywood, and Medicine Lake knew that they needed to lower their prices or risk not only temporarily losing business, but potentially being out of business after what was hoped to be a temporary situation finally ended. After all, decades earlier, the standard method of organizing grieving rituals was conducted almost entirely within the home by women. Offering lower prices is a way for those in the funeral industry to try to ensure that this did not revert back to the state it once was. However, the funeral industry staying in business and continuing to be male-dominated also depended on loved ones of the deceased actively choosing to continue to pay and endorse these gender-restricted businesses to continue to operate. Women were often barred from the professional development trainings for funerary business professionals, thus almost entirely limiting their ability to be able to work in an outside funerary business. Paying for these businesses to handle grieving rituals was an active endorsement of such restrictions on gender expectations. Additionally, home services organized by women within the domestic sphere could have easily become the new norm due to the economic hardships during the Depression, and would have allowed women to instead perform or organize a service from the home rather than through an outside business. No matter the price reduction offered by outside funerary businesses, this option would still be much less expensive than using the services of any business. Yet, despite this, there is almost no evidence that Montanans took this route, despite the Depression hitting the state extremely hard, especially compared to other areas of the country. This endorsement of a male-dominated funerary industry and lack of willingness to allow women to expand their roles within grieving rituals reflects the attitudes of many during the Depression years, that this was a temporary situation and gender roles must return to how they were before the crisis had started. Many believe that in order to achieve this, an expansion of women's roles needed to be limited to what was deemed only necessary, and this did not include expanding roles in grieving rituals. One may be wondering about religious requirements for grieving rituals, that perhaps some people continue to use these outside businesses to organize the rituals only because of religious or cultural encouragement to do so. Of course, this can certainly be the case for many Montanans. All cultural and religious groups have distinct requirements for locations of grieving rituals and other significant ceremonies. And I hope to look into these differences further in my future research and how this changes the general trends that I have observed. In general, however, in Montana, there was an overall trend of weddings, also significant to many on a religious and or cultural level, previously organized mostly by outside businesses, now being conducted at home to save money. For example, there are several instances of Montanans, including those who consider weddings a religious ceremony, choosing to get married in their home or backyard instead of a more costly church or another religious venue. From these examples, we can see that ceremonies, often considered culturally or religiously sacred, were being brought to the home out of necessity in Montana. And yet the organization of grieving rituals was not. Most weddings, though in a different location, of course, did not change much in order of service during the Depression. It continued to follow conventional expectations of the father giving away the bride, an officiant, both religious, either religious or lay, marrying the couple, and the bride expressing vows dedicated to her husband, often using obey in her own section at this time. Despite the fact that home funerals could have been just as popular as home weddings, many refused to change the status quo in regards to this. They believed that the Depression would lift, and as had other economic crises they had seen before. And unlike weddings, most funerals did not have clear differences for male and female participants within the ceremony itself. Expected gender roles were reinforced in many forms of weddings. Unlike weddings, most grieving rituals had no reassurance within the ceremony of verbally reinforcing gender expectations, specifically regarding the common section at this time, where brides vowed to be obedient to their new husbands. Therefore, moving weddings to the domestic sphere was not seen as something that could alter gender role expectations permanently. There was an expectation that when the crisis began to lift, weddings would certainly return to religious or culturally significant centers and away from the home for the most part. However, since most grieving rituals did not invoke this kind of language, moving such ceremonies back to the domestic sphere and allowing women to play greater roles in their organization could have a potentially permanent influence on acceptable roles for women in society that could outlast the Depression. The lowering of prices for these ceremonies by funeral directors and undertakers certainly influenced people's decision to continue leaving such duties to these businesses, but home weddings show that holding a ceremony or organizing it within a domestic sphere at a much lower price than any business discount could offer was a real possibility. Again, this section will require further study into religious and cultural requirements for each community within Montana regarding weddings and funerals. I hope to research further into how distinct cultural and religious groups in Montana adjusted to Depression-era hardships in regard to organizing weddings and funerals, but this is a general trend that I have found so far. And these articles talk about the necessity of home weddings and how to have a home wedding. At this point, it was very common. One may also wonder if there were any laws requiring Montanans to go through a funerary business to bury the dead, or have a trained mortician work on the body before putting the deceased to rest. However, there were not any laws that required burials to go through a business, nor were there actually any laws requiring any sort of service at all. Montana, even to this day, allowed for private burials and funerals. In fact, Montana did not require grave markers or headstones in most cases then. Reporting a death of a loved one then was actually not necessary during the Depression, though most people still did. The only requirements were that they could not be more than a few bodies buried on one property, and they could not be close to agricultural sites. Therefore, home funerals, home burials, or organization for a funerary service from home was perfectly legal during the disastrous economic crisis that plagued the state. Yet almost no one changed to a more domestic-based approach to such rituals from using outside businesses, unlike Depression-era home weddings. Funeral homes stayed in business, and newspapers continuously announced funerals for the deceased that they were organizing through businesses rather than by the deceased family or friends, which these two examples show, talking about going through a funerary business. Excuse me. These pieces of evidence show that a less expensive home-based or female-dominated version of grieving rituals could have potentially become the new standard as an adaptation to the economic crisis at hand. However, to many, the notion of transferring a duty that was deemed male-centric to women could potentially spur change in the supposedly normal gender dynamics on a permanent rather than temporary basis. To many, the Depression and any disruptions it caused to the established dynamics from before were hoped to be only temporary ones by many. To emphasize this point further, there are many examples of women being criticized for working more than what was deemed supposedly necessary. We have a couple of examples up here talking about newspaper articles talking about women who don't need jobs, quote unquote, are criticized, and also criticizing American women for working and blaming them for gaps in the job, for not having jobs available for young men. So male-dominated funeral homes thus continue to flourish. Obituary notices every day cited a burial or funeral service that would be conducted through these funeral homes and almost never privately. I went through massive amounts of obituaries, and almost the entirety of them went through some funerary service that was an outside business. However, a great shift occurred when Montana men were beginning to be sent to war or otherwise unable to work at jobs within the United States as a result of societal wartime changes. Unlike economic crises, this war was a change in society that many were not used to or expecting to end soon. Despite the First World War taking place decades before, American men were only abroad fighting for less than a year, from late 1917 to the fall of 1918. Instead, a war on this level was essentially uncharted territory without an expected end date. Despite President Roosevelt first promising to not send American men to war, he did in early 1942. He then tried to assure families that they would not be abroad long, but at this point, many were starting to not believe him. Many Americans did not know what to believe about the projected length of this particular crisis. Families worried about the person meant to be the head of the household dying or being abroad for years and years. These were very unclear times, and despite reassurance from the government, rapid changes in their policies and stances on the war ensured that many people did not necessarily view this as a temporary situation. Therefore, as a result of such uncharted territory, the conservative resistance to permanent changes in gender roles lessened during this time, and thus such changes were able to survive past the end of the United States' involvement in the war. Women took on many jobs that men typically did while they were fighting abroad. Consequently, there was also several changes in grieving rituals in Montana during the United States' involvement in the war, particularly that being some women playing a larger role in the funerary industry. As a result of the acceptability of women being able to take over the business roles of many of their male family members who went off to war or passed away, women were accepted more within what was before a particularly male-dominated industry. They were no longer entirely barred from this industry and able to expand their roles even beyond the domestic sphere on a much more permanent basis. The funeral industry stayed outside the home, but women were suddenly accepted by many in Montana to become professionals in the business. The war was a significant turning point for women starting to permanently join the previously male-dominated workforces, particularly the funerary industry. The particular crisis of war, unlike the Depression, could not be chalked up to an almost certainly temporary situation, in which changes should, in the viewpoints of the contemporaries, almost certainly return to what they deemed normal. The roles that women had to take up while men were sent abroad were much more extensive than when male breadwinners were out of work or needed help with providing income for the house during the Depression. Women were expected to take over the roles that many during the Depression would not have allowed. The uncertainty of the war ensured that those who had resisted such changes in gender roles, such permanent changes in gender roles, did not have the luxury of being able to focus on preserving gender expectations now, rather revitalizing the economy outside of the domestic sphere and keeping society functional while young men were abroad were the main concerns. Unlike an economic depression, being in the state of, unlike an economic depression, being in a state that was not as cyclical and losing outcome or long-lasting nature of the crisis could be extremely damaging to Montana on many levels. Needless to say, preserving gender expectations was no longer the priority of those who had previously fought for this and their depression. Rather, people realized that on a practical level, expectations for gender roles needed to change to keep society and the economy functional. Thus, in this period, we start to see women taking over grieving rituals. But instead of taking them over within the domestic sphere, like before the mid-19th century, they started to establish themselves as professionals in the industry of death. So this is an example from Butte, Montana. Here we have a prominent funerary business run by a man named Fred I. Root. And so in 1944, Fred passed away, and his wife took over as a partner of the business after he passed. So these are the new advertisements with her name on there, Mrs. Fred I. Root, rather than his own. This would have been unusual if not for the war, when women were becoming more involved in the funerary industries of their husbands and fathers. It would have definitely been extremely unusual for the Depression era, with no female funeral directors in the entire state of Montana. This shows the shifts in attitudes that maybe such gender role changes could become more permanent, unlike the Depression attitude of it being a potentially temporary situation. So rather than being criticized for working more than supposedly, rather than being criticized for working more than supposedly necessary, like she likely would have been in the Depression, she was celebrated for her work too and praised in the local newspaper, showing the shift in attitudes towards changing gender roles and accepting them on a more permanent basis. So these articles talk about how Mrs. Eva A. Root, Fred's wife, who took over the business, singing her praises and saying that she did a wonderful job. Though they had a potential to, all changes in expected gender roles didn't necessarily last permanently, though. The 1950s and post-war era saw many try to ensure that the gender roles in life in general went back to what was deemed normal, with many encouraging women to focus solely on the domestic sphere and heavily discouraging outside work. Yet the effects of the war left their mark. There was essentially no practical way to invest in restricting gender roles during the war, so some changes in gender expectations for women did in fact leave permanent marks on Montanan society. Many women continue to work in outside businesses. The changes that were prompted by the wartime era saw a slow yet consistent rise in female undertakers and funeral directors in the years since. So this is another example. This is the story of Wilda Axelson, maiden name Parker. So she and her husband, who was the director and manager of a funerary business that actually Mrs. Root was once a part of too, were married in 1939. This is an article about that in the Butte Daily Post. However, the couple ended up divorcing in early 1965. But something interesting that I found, in late 1964, right before the divorce was made final, she was made the manager of the business that her husband had once taken over. Whether this was a settlement of divorce is unclear, but it's also apparent that this was not met with criticism, which shows that she clearly had experience working alongside her husband in the family business in the years prior. This is evident by the fact that it does say the appointment was approved by the board of directors, so it cannot have solely been a decision driven by the divorce, most likely. Clearly, Wilda was trusted to run the business. Therefore, it is also clear that she had extensive experience in helping run it throughout the wartime years and post-war years as well. Funerals thus can grant us an interesting lens of some of the values, specifically regarding expectations of gender roles that were held dear in a society during a certain time period. Laying a body to rest could be a medical procedure, but is also a way to honor the life of the deceased, thus ensuring it was a special ceremony for almost all cultures and religions across the United States and across the world as well. Thus, a grieving ritual, whether it be a funeral, a wake, a burial process, can reflect the values that those in a society are trying to preserve or change at any point. During the war, values were less heavily placed on preserving supposedly standard gender roles and primarily were instead focused on doing all possible to increase the chances of winning a fight that could change the course of world history. However, before this, during the Depression, more energy was focused on preserving supposed normalcy as much as possible during what was believed to be a temporary disturbance. And we can clearly see this by the push for women to continue to have limited influence outside the home, particularly shown in regards to funerals and other grieving rituals. Of course, as noted before, both in the past and today, these rituals are distinct between cultures, religions, families, individuals, and communities. Each grieving ritual is unique to honor and remember the specific person that has passed away. And I hope to research further into these distinctions during this time period within Montana. By analyzing these rituals and their changes, we can further understand the ways in which Montanans view crises they were consumed by during the first half of the 20th century. It specifically shows how people perceive the changes in expected gender roles during times of crisis and whether they accepted them as temporary or potentially permanent ones. Thank you.